Welcome to another episode of NBM Talks, a series of the Narrative-Based Medicine Lab, where we speak with individuals who are working at the intersection of literature, medicine, and health. Our guests are writers, clinicians, scholars, artists, and advocates who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the field. Together we discuss how we can engage with narrative-based medicine principles and practices in creative and diverse ways. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Kim, the Medical Education Health Humanities Theme Lead for Temerty Medicine. And today we have Dr. Jordan Goodridge, who is a family physician and clinical educator with a specific focus in 2S LGBTQIA+ health, sexual health, and HIV primary care. With over 5 years of experience working with transgender and gender diverse populations, he offers expert consultation in this area as well as in the field of sexual health. As an assistant professor, the 2S LGBTQIA+ health theme lead and course director at the University of Toronto, as well as through collaboration with Rainbow Health Ontario and CAMH, Dr. Goodridge seeks to advance medical education in these fields. He is passionate about anti-oppression, equity, diversity, and inclusion in medicine, and the impact of intersecting identities that can affect diverse population. So, welcome, Jordan. It's great to have you here.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm happy to be here today.
So, I think it would be good for our listeners to know a little bit more about how you arrived in this role as the 2S LGBTQIA+ theme lead for Temerty Medicine.
Yeah. So, as a gay man myself, I've always been interested in queer health from a very young age. And so as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do clinically, I was from early stages in training, looking at what's around, and I found out about the HIV Enhanced Skills program at the University of Toronto. And so through that, I got to do a lot of work with 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. From that, I joined Sherbourne Health Center's LGBTQ+ health team. And that really allowed me to work closely with these communities and develop competencies that would be necessary to provide kind of the best care possible. And then in terms of my educational roles, a few years in, I took over a role as course director in the year 2 course. But I still did end up getting quite involved in terms of updating some of the 2S LGBTQIA health content in the curriculum, recording some videos, some content for the students themselves. And then so when the role of 2S LGBTQIA+ health theme lead became available, I kind of jumped on that, feeling like I was already kind of doing a lot of that work and could build on some of the projects I had already started, in terms of sexual health, in terms of gender identity and exploration and content around that, in terms of gender-affirming care and surgeries. That was a lot of the work that I was already doing and would be really, grateful or welcome to help update and continue to do.
Well, our listeners are particularly interested in the intersections of narrative medicine and narrative practices and the arts and humanities. So I'm curious, how has art or the health humanities influenced your work as a physician, in particular related to your role?
Yeah, so I think from a very young age, art and I would say especially film has really exposed me to some perspectives that I might as well or I might not have been exposed to or appreciated to the same extent if I hadn't been exposed. So I think a lot of people have heard of the musical theater film Rent. This came out when I was a teenager. And for those who haven't seen it, it was, I think, a lot of people's first exposure to, some narratives and perspectives of individuals, living in New York, where an individual develops HIV and what that experience is like, dealing with the kind of repercussions of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and epidemic. And yeah, it really kind of, I guess, displayed to me and showed me how certain marginalized populations were, disproportionately affected by this virus and the impact that it had in a way that I don't think I would have appreciated without that exposure. So as an adult, and then when I started my medical training, I think there had already been huge advancements in terms of antiretroviral therapy and treatment for HIV. And so I think it was a very different infection and condition to treat by that point compared to, the perspectives and the experiences of people who lived through the HIV epidemic when it was at its worst. So I think that really gave me an appreciation and understanding that I wouldn't have had And I've taken that with me when I've, interacted with my patients who are alive and who have seen some of their loved ones and family members and friends die, unfortunately, at very young ages from that. And I think that's a huge role that art and the health humanities can play is this idea of storytelling and getting an exposure to perspectives that we otherwise wouldn't be seeing. So yeah, I thought that was really helpful for me understanding what that was actually like in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, which I wouldn't have otherwise been, I think, as aware of, unfortunately.
You mentioned already that film in particular was a place that where you felt some influence and really had exposure to the other kinds of narratives of lived experiences. And I'm wondering if there is a book, film, art exhibition, or some kind of theater piece that shifted your perspective recently.
Yeah, so more recently, I watched the show Pose. It's been out now for a number of years, but I was kind of, I guess, a later adopter to it. I'm very glad I came across it as some recommendations from my friends. And basically, it's a show that centers on, the ballroom scene. And at the time, it was a place where people who were 2S LGBTQ identified, a lot of gay men and sexual minority patients, trans and gender diverse folks would kind of gather, would express themselves in ways that they might not have felt comfortable expressing themselves on the streets out in society in a very homophobic and transphobic community, especially, at the time that this was set decades ago. And I really love the show. It's one that really features a lot of trans and gender diverse actors and folks and voices, and particularly minority groups or sub-minority groups, I should say. So it also really highlights, the intersecting identities of being trans and being a person of color, for instance, and how that leads to unique experiences and unique challenges and difficulties that these characters have to find unique and creative ways to overcome. So I thought I loved the show because I learned a lot from it in terms of, actually seeing the experiences and struggles that the community can face. And honestly, a lot of the struggles that some of my patients, even who are trans and gender diverse, have faced in their own lives, and give me a better kind of understanding and a different perspective than I think we're privy to as healthcare providers with, our own agendas and our own focuses. And we sometimes can lose sight, unfortunately, of that perspective. So I felt like this was a really good way to remember and understand some of the barriers, the transphobia that our patients face and how to kind of overcome them, what sorts of supports our patients and people might need. A lot of the themes that I had, seen in the show itself actually was, I think, a strong reflection of what a number of people go through, be it, difficulty accessing hormones and even using black market hormones, right? Difficulty accessing gender-affirming surgeries, difficulty attaining and maintaining employment. Like, these are all very real issues that so many individuals in the trans and gender diverse communities face. And I've tried to take that as much as I can to my own clinical practice, that perspective and those understandings of how I can intervene.
Great. You've spoken a lot about how it's influenced and also helped to shift your perspective or have a greater understanding for the experiences of a diverse population. And I'm curious, as an educator and in your role in particular, with the exposure you have to medical learners, if there are particular key narratives that you feel are important to target and address as new learners are coming in, or even those who are at later stages of practice, and if you'd like to speak a bit to that.
Yeah. I think one, really important narrative, and one that I think is highlighted, for instance, in the show Pose, is this idea that our communities, the sexual and gender minority communities, or 2S LGBTQI plus communities, we are really resilient as a peoples. We've had to face, I think, a number of hardships. We've had to grow up in a world that isn't the most accepting of our identities, unfortunately. And this is still to this day even true in Canada, which, is one of the more progressive countries, worldwide, I think, when we compare to many others. But it's this idea, this understanding that, there's still ways in which we can intervene and support people from these communities. And particularly, I think there are unfortunately a lot of negative, stereotypes and narratives around trans and gender diverse communities, especially at this point in history. This is one of the populations that are the most disenfranchised and where, we could do the most in terms of being allies, being advocates, being support. So, I think we really do need to push this narrative that, yes, trans and gender diverse people are resilient, but that there are ways that we can help, fight for them, support them, advocate for them, actually demonstrate to them that we value their perspectives, identities, and that we validate them, that we recognize them as true. This is unfortunately, I think, in a lot of parts even of Canada, but certainly of other parts of North America, this is a major concern right now, right, is looking at the rights of trans and gender diverse people to, speak to what is their truth and actually access the care that would help them to live in their true identities, be it gender-affirming care, especially for people post-puberty as adolescents. So I think, we need to address some of those negative and incorrect stereotypes, that people don't know their own gender identities, because we know gender identities are formed from an early age and are reinforced throughout, their time growing up. And so instead, those harmful narratives need to be replaced by what's actually true, what's factual, and what we do have evidence, of in our communities.
That's great. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about how where we are at in history, where this idea of identity and identity formation is something that has quite a bit of scientific research behind, and that it's not simply a decision per se. And I'm curious to hear a bit more on this idea of what it means to be an ally, even if you are someone who may not identify with being a member of the community, but how you would speak to someone when trying to encourage, in particular in the role as a medical professional, as a health advocate, and as a scholar and someone who needs to be professional. If you have any words you'd like to speak to on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost, allies have to be open to learning. That's the biggest thing. So to be a true ally, you have to be responsive to the needs, of this community that you may not find yourself a part of. You may have friends, you may have family, you may be able to learn about some of these needs, some of these perspectives from them directly, or you might choose to, engage with art and engage in media and other outlets that actually help to provide this perspective. And the first and foremost thing is to learn, but then also be reflective towards your own behaviors, towards your own potential biases, right? Every single one of us have been socialized in whatever society, whatever culture we grew up in. And no one is completely free from bias. I'm not completely free from bias. I'm sure, you have your own biases. We all have our own biases, which are based on what we were taught from very early ages and what's been reinforced through our own experiences. So in order to be a really good ally, we actually have to sit with ourselves and understand where these biases come from, recognize them so that they don't inadvertently, come into our understandings of the world in negative ways that would actually be harmful, right? And I think this is something that we've seen, unfortunately. The medical system has and continue to harm trans and gender diverse folks, as has the rest of society, as has discriminatory workplaces. So to be an ally, we have to recognize that, take ownership of that, and then do something to address that, right? And it can be something as easy as speaking up when you see transphobia or discrimination happening. It can be looking at your own workplace, let's say your practice, and trying to better understand what needs there are for these clients and how you can better support them and take down barriers. Because I think if you're not aware of what those are, there's no way you could actually intervene. But if you could start to put yourself into their shoes and you start to learn how to empathize with their own experience, that's how you could be a better ally. So really, it's all mostly just about being open to learning, being open to reflection, and identifying based on, your position, based on your power, right? Where do you have power? and how can you leverage that in support of these communities who may not be given as much power and access and control as you may have in a certain situation or circumstance.
Wonderful. That's really beautifully said. Um, it makes me think about, when in this theme role, you have a leadership position.
Mhm.
And if there was something or a moment in your life where you realized that you not wanted to, you obviously were very interested in this from a clinical perspective, but what drove you with that added push to want to step into a leadership role, where you are role modeling and you're teaching and you're giving language to how to be an advocate for this diverse community?
Yeah, yeah. So, I think definitely some of it was my lived experience, as I mentioned, as a gay man. I think I've had my own experiences with physicians that were less than comfortable, we'll say, to put it nicely. Um, and I would say still that they're probably only a fraction as uncomfortable as some of the experiences that my own patients have shared with me. So while there's still homophobia, while there's still discrimination against sexual minority patients, um, when I compare that to some of the true overt transphobia and implicit bias that a lot of people have against transgender diverse folks, I recognize that there's still a long ways we can go. And when we look at kind of like the development or the progression of rights in the trans and gender diverse communities compared to sexual minority communities, this happened a lot later in Canadian history. And we know cultural perspectives and opinions will take a lot longer to actually change and to reflect some of those, let's say, legislation changes, which, as we've seen, can also be reversed. So I think a big thing that propelled me into it was my work at the Sherbourne Health Centre, working with particularly trans and gender diverse communities and learning so much more about what barriers they face and what difficulties in accessing care and resources and things like that occur as a result of the society we live in. And that actually, I found that work to be by far the most rewarding work I do, is helping to kind of dismantle these barriers, helping them to access gender-affirming hormones or gender-affirming surgeries if that's within what their desires are, what their embodiment goals are. Because, of course, not every trans or gender diverse person wishes to undergo a medical transition. But for those who do, we see that this is really life-saving. We see that rates of depression and suicidality and things like that decrease dramatically, more than 10 times when people are able to access the care and the resources that they deserve. So I think it was actually, what I had seen and what I've learned from the trans and gender diverse community actually that really pushed me to want to take on this role, because I felt like this was a place I could intervene, relatively early on when students are early in their training. I could help them to recognize that we all can and really should do this work, right? This isn't work that needs to be done at a specialist level. If, let's say, family physicians, which absolutely are a specialty in and of themselves, if they feel comfortable prescribing testosterone in cisgender men who have low testosterone levels, or hormone replacement therapy in postmenopausal females, let's say, a lot of those same principles when it comes to dosing and monitoring and things like that actually are very similar to what we do and the dosing and monitoring we use in trans and gender diverse folks. So, I recognize that what I could do is help students to make that connection of I can do this work. I'm already a sponge. I'm already absorbing so much in my medical training. And this can be just another kind of tool I add to my toolkit when I'm thinking about what care I can provide for my patients going forward. So I would actually thank the trans and gender diverse community really for helping to motivate me to really want to do this work, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I hear a lot of compassion that you have. And I also hear what you're saying in terms of approaching this all from a place of curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And doing some very difficult, I think what our conversation is highlighting is how to sit with discomfort
Mm-hmm.
or how to sit with assumptions. And from this, I'm also wanting to hear a bit more on how you guide learners into, looking at the stories that have, or the influences that have shaped their narrative that they arrive with,
Hmm.
and then guiding them to at least, enter into some kind of examination of it without necessarily moving them into a place of shame
Hmm.
for having carried that. So, yeah, would love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the first thing that I try to do when I'm trying to, I guess, develop empathy amongst the students with whom I work, is to try to link the experiences of another community, let's say the trans and gender diverse communities, to their own experiences. And sometimes I'll give an example. So for me, I think there are a number of similarities that I see between sexual minority patients, gay individuals, lesbian individuals, bisexual, pansexual, etc., um, and how we've been treated by the medical system, how we've been treated by society. Originally, homosexuality was in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as a psychiatric illness. And I think we've come a long way since then in terms of not viewing it as a psychiatric illness, right? But that wasn't actually that long ago. About 50 years ago was when it was removed from there. And so that was hugely stigmatizing. And that could cause a lot of harm, right, within the medical system, but as well that harm bleeds out to the rest of these individuals' lives and the stigma that they face and internalize, unfortunately. And that's not very unlike the diagnoses that we have had for trans and gender diverse individuals in terms of psychiatric, conditions, as we sometimes have alluded to before. So one thing that I try to help develop empathy in my students is figuring out what sorts of connections they can make to their own experiences, things that they can understand, at least to a certain degree. Everyone has kind of different levels of privilege and power versus oppression and disadvantage. And trying to kind of figure out where your own social location is, I think, is really important. And then relating that to the group that you're trying to better understand, I think can already go a long, long way. And then remind me I think there's another part of your question that I wanted to answer, but I've lost it.
Oh, no, just wanting to hear a bit more how you guide students through this, and also in a way where it doesn't make them move to a place of shame for having,
Yes.
for just arriving and being influenced by larger social forces that you may not always have an awareness of.
Right. Yes. And that is actually such a great question. And I explain to students too, I have certain parts about my own identity that may make me more prone to oppression and discrimination as a gay man, as a Black individual. But at the same time, I also hold certain social locations and identities that do give me influence and power. I'm a physician. I am a man. And unfortunately, in our society, there are still certain privileges and power that does come with that, right? I have education. I'm of a certain socioeconomic status. And I explain to students that it's not about feeling guilty or shameful, but it's just about recognizing that some of these identities just carry more power with them or just, provide you sometimes unearned privilege. But that doesn't have to be a negative thing. You can use that privilege and leverage it, make it a positive thing that you leverage in support of the communities who maybe aren't afforded that same level of privilege, right? So I think by sharing my own perspective, that helps other learners, other trainees feel like they can reflect and do this work and understand it without shying away. Because I think that's the biggest thing is people will, feel a little cognitive dissonance around things that they don't feel comfortable with. And I think because of that, we're not necessarily prone to reflect on these difficult things. So actually showing someone how to do it and then encourage them to take the time and sit with it and understand themselves better in that way. And then view it as a positive thing that they can use to their advantage by being an ally, like we said. That's really where I think a lot of the positive change happens, and where, instead of feeling shame about it, they'll feel empowered and excited to be advocates and to use that power for good.
Mhm. I feel like what you've poetically demonstrated is really the power of narrative, of how when you share your own personal story and experiences, it's the relatability that often helps to bring people into a sense of connection where they, and also offer a place of safety for doing this kind of really difficult examination. And this is such a timely conversation when there's a lot of feelings of struggle around where people fit and how we fit together and how we move together forward as communities. And wanting also to give an opportunity to you to speak about that, of how we have, within these larger subsections of society, we still are a community that needs to learn how to make enough space for everyone just to have shared dialogue, and how we move through dialogue and demonstrate respect, and really treating each with dignity and compassion as we go. So curious if you have some words you'd like to say to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's such a difficult thing to try to address, because there are absolutely going to be some people who are, at least at this point in their lives, very firm in their beliefs and ideologies and perspectives. But I think we can recognize that, honestly, as humans, there's a lot of similarities we have, even when we don't see it. And I honestly am a firm believer that we have more similarities than we do differences, right? And sometimes for a certain individual to kind of develop a different perspective, they need some sort of catalyst, whether it be like a friend or a family member or someone who maybe comes out as gay or trans or gender diverse. And then sometimes that's what's needed in order to shift a person's thinking. But there are a lot of people who maybe just have been prone to or have come across some misinformation, and that's led them to feel or believe a certain thing. And sometimes it is okay to gently challenge them, and you're not always going to be met with a huge amount of resistance, right? So it's, gently being the key word, because it's highly uncomfortable for anyone to be challenged, head on about any deep-rooted feeling, belief, perspective that they have. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's like a lot of great ways to do it. I think, there are art, film, theater, readings that people can come across to develop these perspectives and to try to, I guess, get us on the same page and feel more as a collective community, all working towards kind of the shared goal of equity, about supporting people who need it, and, as a society progressing together rather than isolating and separating ourselves and fragmenting ourselves, as I think we've seen, unfortunately, more and more of, especially when it comes to people's kind of deep-rooted beliefs and their political values and views, right? I think instead it's about thinking about and reflecting on what similarities we actually have with one another, and having these like more difficult conversations in an open-minded way, right? Where you're saying, I'm just going to approach this, like we said before, with curiosity of, why do you feel this way? Why do you feel different from me? What has led you in your life to, believe X, Y, or Z? And what has led me to believe this other perspective? What is true, right? Like, we all shape our own realities. Our realities are our own, right? Just based on our own perspectives, based on our own viewpoint. So I think it's about being receptive to hearing where another person is coming from, being gentle with them, and then maybe helping to provide your own narrative, your own story, and seeing what lands, and then being responsive to that. I think if we all were able to do that a bit more, a bit better, there wouldn't be such polarization as we've seen, especially on the internet and things like that, where it's more so it just feels like people are yelling over each other to try to get their voice heard. Instead, it should be viewed as curiosity of understanding, why do you feel that way? And why is that so different from how I feel?
Mm-hmm. You've actually spouted off some beautiful writing prompts right there in that response. And I also hear these really powerful themes of humility, mm-hmm. and courage and gentleness in thinking about how we approach this in a way that is forward-moving and also not alienating. Mm-hmm. And I also hear you talking about things around cognitive dissonance, but maybe also emotional readiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because these are difficult things, and just listening to you speak about your experience and the experience of others that you've witnessed, and also have tried to advocate for, of thinking of how much it takes, again, courage to sit with the possibility that maybe my story is one that needs examining. Um, Now, I did ask if to you to bring a reading, and I'm just wondering if you want to speak to how you chose what you will read for us in a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I just thought it was a very beautiful poem, to be honest. And so I wanted to find, of course, as my role as 2S LGBTQI plus health theme lead, it would be irresponsible if I chose something that wasn't by a queer author. So, I did some perusing and I just kind of sat with something that just felt beautiful to me. I do like a lot of poems about kind of love, and especially if it's queer love. I think oftentimes, there's a sort of within the voice of the author, you can hear there's a sense of, isolation, loneliness, and then overcoming that loneliness and the excitement that can come from that. I think that's the perspective of a lot of sexual and gender minority individuals who, spend a lot of time not being able to showcase who they are, their authentic self, to the world, to their families. And that can be hugely, hugely isolating. We could feel closed off and that the world around us is closed and cold. So I don't know. I think one thing I like from this poem is that, it does allude to, I guess, a pathetic fallacy, the environment around them being kind of cold, but then that warm invitingness of, making a connection with someone that feels true and authentic and exciting and valuable. That's why I chose the one that I did.
Oh, interesting. You mentioned the phrase queer love,
Mm-hmm.
and that caught my attention, and I want to hear a bit more about how you define that and what that stands for you.
Yeah. So I think just because we've, for so many years, in growing up as a queer individual, we've been told by society it's either not normal, right? It's wrong. And this is the idea when you grow up in a cis heteropatriarchy, which the vast majority of societies I feel like are, you're told that those, who have influence with power are generally cisgender or generally heterosexual, often, white men. And so growing up in that society, I think, can be really harmful. And we have to unlearn a lot of things as we dismantle that internalized stigma that we've taken in with us, right? So to me, queer love is this exciting thing that occurs, after you give yourself permission to do what, might be taboo or what other people have told you isn't right, isn't normal. And then I think with queer love, it's actually sometimes a great learning tool. It's something that teaches you more about yourself, something that you sometimes feel like you have to fight for, right? In a way that maybe people who are heterosexual or straight, don't have to fight in the same ways or for the same reasons. And so I think it's something that's very exciting and something to be proud of when you do find it.
Great. Well, that again is just beautifully said. And as we, wind down this interview, are there some closing thoughts you'd like to give before we cap it off with a reading by you of this poem you've chosen?
Yeah. One thing I say to all of the learners that I work with is that gender-affirming care with trans and gender diverse folks with whom I work is easily, again, the most rewarding work that I do, and that I encourage everyone to approach, gender-affirming care with curiosity and excitement, to see how you can incorporate it into your own practice. And for those who are non-medical and who are listening, how can you better support trans and gender diverse communities even in your own work? What invisible barriers might there be for them accessing your services? Recognizing that they may have more challenges in terms of gaining employment and maintaining it. And what does that mean in terms of financial supports and resources? What does that mean in terms of even transportation and getting to, wherever it is you work or what supports you may provide to the communities with whom you work? So it's about, again, doing that reflection, that hard work, putting yourselves in perspectives that aren't yours and really doing whatever you can to be allies to these beautiful communities, these completely, unique, wonderful individuals. And you'll find that you gain so much, I don't know, just it's so rewarding. You gain so much and you learn so much by hearing from perspectives that are different from yours. So I'd really encourage every single listener to think about what one thing they can do at their own workplace and their own lives to make the environments in which they work and live and play more accessible, to communities other than themselves.
Thank you, Jordan. Those are some great words that make me realize that what you do is really at the cutting edge of, a society that continues to grow and change and shift. And it's been wonderful just listening to you and hearing how you've been navigating throughout your lifetime something that's been quite an incredible journey and story that I think our listeners will have appreciated hearing. So just saying thank you to Dr. Jordan Goodridge, who is the 2S LGBTQIA+ theme lead for Temerty Faculty of Medicine. And I'm Sarah Kim, the Health Humanities lead. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, check out many other episodes. And if you're interested in learning more about narrative-based medicine, visit us online at narrativebasedmedicine.ca for more great content and to explore our upcoming offerings.